In the early morning hours of November 1973, an envelope arrived at the offices of an Italian newspaper in Rome. Inside was a lock of reddish hair and a human ear wrapped in tissue. The note beside it read, "This is Paul's ear. If we don't get some money within 10 days, then the other ear will arrive. In other words, he will arrive in little bits." The boy's name was John Paul Getty III. He was 16 years old, and he had been held in the mountains of southern Italy for 4 months by that point, ever since a group of men had pulled him off a street in Rome's Piazza Farnese in the middle of the night. His captors wanted $17 million, and the man who could write that check without noticing it was missing. His own grandfather, the richest private citizen alive, had refused to pay a single dollar of it. He had a line ready when reporters asked why. "I have 14 grandchildren," he said, "and if I pay 1 penny of ransom now, I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." It sounded, at first, like the calculation of a rational man protecting his family from a pattern of extortion. It was not that. When the ear finally arrived and the pressure became unbearable, the old man did pay. But even then, he structured the payment the way he structured everything else in his life. He covered only the portion of the ransom he could write off against his taxes, a little over $2 million. The rest, close to $1 million more, he did not give. He lent it to his own son, the boy's father, at 4% interest, to be repaid in full. His grandson came home missing part of an ear, addicted to the drugs his captors had used to keep him compliant, and carrying a debt to his own grandfather that his father would spend years paying back. Ask yourself the obvious question before we go further. This was the richest man who had ever lived, up to that point in history, by some measures the first person on Earth confirmed to be worth more than $1 billion while still breathing. He did not need the money he was protecting. He needed nothing that a stranger's ransom could possibly threaten. So why did he treat his own grandson's freedom as a transaction to be minimized, structured, and billed with interest, the same way he would have handled a bad lease on a drilling rig? The easy answer is the one everyone reaches for. He was simply a miser, a cold and broken old man who loved oil more than his own blood. That explanation is comforting because it makes him a monster and the rest of us safe from ever becoming him. It also happens to be too small for what actually happened inside that family, because the ear was not the only tragedy that year, and it was not even the first one that summer. 5 months before his grandson was taken off that street in Rome in June of 1973, the old man's eldest son locked himself in a bedroom in Los Angeles after a bitter argument with his wife. He had spent the evening drinking, then swallowing pills, then, according to the accounts that survived him, firing a shotgun into the air and threatening the household before turning a barbecue fork on his own stomach. He was found unconscious. The family, worried more about scandal than survival, drove him to a private hospital far from the nearest emergency room rather than risk the story leaking, and he died there. His name was George Franklin Getty II. He had spent his entire adult life as the heir apparent to his father's oil empire, executive vice president, chief operating officer, a man other executives described as brilliant and steady. He used to call his father Mr. Getty, even in private conversation. He once told a colleague that meeting with his own father felt like climbing Mount Olympus. He referred to himself, without much irony, as the vice president in charge of failure. His father did not attend his wedding. He rarely visited his 3 granddaughters. When George died, the old man's chief concern, by every account that survives, was making sure the cause of death never reached the newspapers because it might embarrass the company. That is the detail that breaks the miser explanation apart. A miser hoards money because he is afraid of losing it. What was happening inside this family was not fear. It was a fully formed philosophy applied with total consistency that treated every form of generosity, financial or emotional, as a weakness to be guarded against, even when the person on the other end of it was his own child. To understand where that philosophy came from, you have to go back to the beginning, because the man who built this fortune did it by taking exactly the kind of risk he would later refuse to take on his own family's behalf. His name was John Paul Getty, born in Minneapolis in 1892, the only surviving child of a lawyer turned Oklahoma oilman named George Franklin Getty. The father built a modest fortune drilling in the fields around Tulsa and brought his son into the business at 21. The young man made his first million by the time he was 23, mostly through fast, aggressive land speculation during the Oklahoma oil boom, and then did something that would define the rest of his life. He spent the next several years living as a playboy in Los Angeles, chasing actresses and burning through money until his devout, disapproving father decided he could not be trusted with the family's future. When the elder Getty died in 1930, he left his son only a third of the family oil company's stock. The controlling two-thirds went to his widow, Paul's own mother, a deliberate and public statement that his son had not yet earned the right to run anything alone. That single decision shaped everything that followed. Paul Getty spent the better part of the next 2 decades proving his mother wrong, buying up stock in every oil company he could find, expanding the family's modest holdings into a sprawling web of drilling operations, refineries, and tanker fleets until he had assembled enough to finally take real control. And then, in 1949, already approaching 60 years old, he made the single boldest bet of his career. He negotiated a 60-year concession to drill in a stretch of barren desert called the Neutral Zone, a strip of land jointly held by Saudi Arabia and Kuwait that every major oil company on Earth had already tested and walked away from. He paid the Saudi king $9.5 million up front, plus $1 million a year for 6 decades, plus a royalty rate 2.5 times what the industry majors were paying anywhere else in the Middle East, for land that had never produced a single barrel of oil. His own advisors thought he had lost his mind. He never once set foot in the region himself. He sent his eldest son, George, to oversee the drilling in his place. For 4 years, nothing came out of the ground but sand and dry holes, and Getty poured another $18 million into the project on top of the original bet. Then, in 1953, the wells hit the Wafra field, and oil began coming out of that desert at a rate of 16 million barrels a year. By 1957, Fortune magazine put a number on what that gamble had produced and named Jean-Paul Getty the richest man in America. He would hold some version of that title, richest man in the world, for the rest of his life. $1 billion isn't what it used to be, he told reporters when the number was first put to him, and it was the kind of joke a man makes when he has just proven that his instincts about risk were sound the entire time. Here is the paradox sitting underneath everything else in this story. The same instincts that made Getty extraordinarily good at gambling $9.5 million on a stretch of empty desert made him almost incapable of extending trust anywhere it could not be measured, tested, and collected on. He treated risk as something to calculate ruthlessly in business and something to eliminate entirely in his personal life. And the people closest to him lived inside that second category. He installed a payphone in the guest hallway of his English country estate, Sutton Place, so that visitors, some of them titled aristocrats, some of them his own children, would have to pay for their own long-distance calls rather than run up his bill. He married 5 times and was, by nearly every account from every wife, cold, controlling, and chronically unfaithful throughout each marriage. When his youngest son died of a brain tumor at 12 years old in 1958, Getty did not attend the funeral. Work, he said, made it impossible to leave. He would say something almost identical 15 years later when his eldest son died, and again in his own quiet way when his grandson was being held in an Italian mountainside with pieces of his body arriving in the mail. None of this makes him a cartoon villain twirling a mustache over a pile of gold. It makes him something more useful to understand, because the instinct did not appear the moment he became rich. It is the same instinct, scaled up, that made him a brilliant oil man in the first place. Control every variable you can, trust nothing you have not personally verified, and never, under any circumstances, hand something valuable to another person without first making sure they have earned it. That approach built an empire out of a worthless stretch of desert. Applied to his own children and grandchildren, the exact same approach produced a body count. Watch how the pattern compounds across a single generation. In 1958, the son who might have grown up in a normal household instead dies of illness alone, his father absent by choice. In June of 1973, the son who spent his entire adult life trying to earn his father's approval takes his own life rather than continue trying. 5 weeks later, in July of that same summer, a 16-year-old grandson is dragged off a Roman street by men who have correctly guessed that his family's wealth will make him valuable, and it takes his grandfather 4 months and a piece of his own flesh in the mail before that grandfather will part with a fraction of a fortune he could not possibly spend down in 10 lifetimes. The boy comes home in December, physically alive, and the addiction his captors instilled in him to keep him docile never fully lets go. 8 years later, in 1981, he suffers a massive stroke brought on by that addiction and spends the rest of his life partially blind, unable to speak, confined to a wheelchair, dying decades later at 54. 4 decades after that, in 2015, a grandson of the next generation, Andrew Getty, is found dead on the floor of his own bathroom in Los Angeles, a toxic level of methamphetamine in his system. Every fortune collapse story in this pattern usually ends with a courtroom or a bank statement. This one keeps ending in a coroner's report. Here is where it is worth pausing, because unlike almost every other version of this story, the money itself never actually disappeared. There was no lawsuit that stripped the Gettys of control, no forced sale to strangers, no dilution across careless heirs. When John Paul Getty died in 1976, his oil company was still entirely his to leave behind, and when his heirs sold Getty Oil to Texaco 8 years later, the deal was worth over $10 billion, one of the largest corporate transactions in American history up to that point. The fortune was, by any measure a banker would use, a total success. It survived him completely intact. What did not survive was almost everything the fortune was supposedly protecting in the first place. And there is one place, oddly, where Getty's money did flow freely, without hesitation, without a loan agreement or an interest rate attached: art. He spent decades and tens of millions of dollars assembling one of the finest private collections of Greek and Roman antiquities and European paintings in the world, and he built a museum on his estate in Malibu to house it, a Roman villa reconstructed brick by brick on the California coastline. When he died, the trust he left behind to fund that museum was so enormous that it is, to this day, the wealthiest art institution on the planet, its endowment worth many billions of dollars, still funding conservation work and acquisitions, and free public admission decades after his death. He gave that institution everything, without ever once asking it to prove it deserved him first. The difference is obvious once you say it out loud. A museum cannot disappoint you. It cannot ask for love it hasn't earned, cannot embarrass you at a dinner party, cannot need you to show up for its wedding. It simply exists and holds what you give it forever, exactly the way you left it. So strip away the oil and the ear and the desert concession. And here is what is actually sitting at the center of this particular story. Every other collapse in this pattern is a story about money that could not survive contact with people, split too many ways, spent on monuments, sold off to strangers because nobody built the machine to hold it together. This is the opposite failure, and in its own way, the more unsettling one. Here, the machine held perfectly. The control never slipped for a single day. And it turns out that a fortune guarded that completely, protected against every possible loss except the one that actually mattered, can survive its owner in flawless condition while quietly costing him nearly everyone he was supposedly protecting it for. The next time you hear the phrase, "the richest man in the world," used as a kind of blessing, remember what J. Paul Getty actually said the day his own grandson's freedom was on the table. 14 grandchildren, and a fear of being taken advantage of by even one of them was reason enough to let the first ear arrive in the mail before the second one had a chance to follow. The fortune was never actually in danger. It was never going to run out, never going to be divided, never going to slip into anyone else's hands. What ran out, quietly, year after tragic year, was every single person the money was supposedly there to protect.